doing DeFi, greatest in the world, and they finally about to see why. What you know about XRD? I'm smart money, I ain't never on a decline. What you know about NFTs? It's not just Ace, when you finally gonna realize you need scalability, need more utility, then you better call on these guys. I'm going radical, I'm going radish, I'm going radical, I'm going radish. Hyperspeed DeFi, never on a decline, building the future, I feel like a savage.
Hello and welcome. I am Piers Ridyard, CEO of RDX Works, a core developer of the decentralized finance protocol Radix, a public ledger entirely focused on bringing DeFi into the mainstream. This is our podcast, The DeFi Download, a show about decentralized finance and all things crypto, where we dive into the details of the projects, assets, and services that are powering the DeFi revolution. Today, I'm joined by Matthew Graham, founder and CEO of Sino Global Capital. Sino Global Capital is a venture capital firm specializing in bringing international blockchain companies into emerging markets. Matthew, it was great to have you on the show.
Great to be here today. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So, let's just start off with the Matty Sino story. How did it all get started?
Sure thing. So I'm an emerging market specialist. In my past life, so to speak, I was a sell-side banker focused on bridging technologies to mainland China for strategic partnership and investment. And I had for many years been following Bitcoin as a technology. I thought it was super interesting. I thought there were a lot of question marks around whether or not we were all going to make it in those early Bitcoin days. And I had some initial attempts to combine what was then kind of my hobby with my professional life, such as in 2013 when I pitched with my banker hat on, I pitched one of our big clients, one of the largest telecom manufacturers in the world, on having a hardware software combination solution for Bitcoin power enthusiasts, which is an idea that he really hated. So I had, he says one of the worst ideas he's ever heard is what he actually said. So I had some very initial attempts to take my hobby and bridge it to my professional life. But then when I founded my own shop in 2015, and then when Ethereum hit, suddenly this was a much bigger story. This to me was a 10,000 times bigger story. And I felt like I needed to get ahead of it in every way that I could. I felt like it was a generational opportunity, kind of like, the internet in the late 1990s, basically is how I saw it from a United States perspective. So at that point, we pivoted. We quickly pivoted my own shop at that time, and we also started making a move to the buy side with some angel investments and some forays into the secondary market, and we kind of grew from there.
Okay, and so what was it about Ethereum that made you go, this is a generational opportunity?
So, to me, Bitcoin was a tremendously important technology that had a core set of functions that were super sexy and super intellectually interesting. And I don't want to undercut the revolution that Bitcoin was in any way, because we really have an enormous debt of gratitude that we owe not just to Satoshi, but to the early adopters and pioneers and revolutionaries and rebels and cowboys and the whole lot. We owe them so much, so I don't want to downplay the significance of Bitcoin. But to me, Ethereum meant that we could now move beyond a core functionality, and we were really talking about a whole suite of potential applications, which could almost be breathtaking, and I think we've really seen that. The fact that we can be adding intelligence to money, and we can have programmability, and we can have smart contracts, and it can impact not just money, but it can impact art, all kinds of things. And so to me, all of a sudden we were talking about not just money, but value across a variety of domains. And so that was really like a breathtaking moment for me when I suddenly realized that this was a much, much, much bigger story. And so we immediately pivoted to a focus on crypto. We went all in.
So you were already investing at this stage, and
so again, I was a tech banker. And so then we pivoted from the sell side to the buy side, and we started investing mostly in the secondary market in the beginning. as we built our competency, and they grew from there.
And so Sino Global Capital, was that already a thing at that point, or was that created later?
So I founded my own shop in 2015, and so it wasn't too far after when we pivoted to a focus exclusively on crypto. The concept had always been that we would naturally and organically develop one or more sector competencies, and we naturally and organically focused on just one, and that's digital assets, blockchain, Web3, crypto. We go by so many different names now, but
and like, how did the China focus come in, or how did, like, obviously Sino referring to China, like how did that come about, and why was that so important even at the start?
Sure. So China obviously is an enormously complicated market, and it's one that continues to be important to crypto even now. And I think we've seen that even with the success of projects like StepN earlier this year. A huge component of StepN's early users were Chinese. Many anonymous developers are either from China or still reside in China. It's an enormously important market, and it's an enormously complicated market. We've seen many cycles of China bans and things like that over the years. But I think that one thing is true, and that's that the best international blockchain projects in the world have an enormous need for trusted investors that can help them in these emerging markets. And so in the beginning, we had that focus with respect to China, and we've since expanded our emerging markets focus to in 2022, when we are from Egypt to Malaysia and everywhere in between, including India and Greater China and such. We help bring the best projects in the world to more than 3 billion people with experts, boots on the ground, and we believe that we do that in a way that no one else can.
Yeah, I mean, like, China's a really tough market for a bunch of reasons. You live in China, right?
No, I don't. I'm basically, it's a cliche, but I'm basically a digital nomad at this point. I just kind of circle the globe.
Okay. I mean, I see enough tweets of you in China, like at like random gyms in like sort of in the back of Beyond, that maybe indicates that you do spend quite a lot of time out there. From the point of view of, and do you speak Chinese? Have you spent a lot of time in China?
I do. I speak Mandarin. I'm fluent in Mandarin.
And so, like, how has China changed? And like, with regards to as a foreigner working in the country, like making a successful, continuous successful, basically woofy, right? Like, or foreign enterprise trying to build in the Chinese market. Like, how have you found that?
I mean, a couple things. So I'm not based in China. I haven't actually been back to China for more than 5 or 6 months, actually. So first of all, I'm not based in China, number one. Number two, we are an offshore entity. We are not a China entity. And then number three, I think that it's legal to invest in crypto assets. So even if the first 2 points were not true, it's legal to invest in crypto assets. An offshore fund can certainly do that. So for a variety of reasons, none of those things affect us. But China is certainly an enormously complicated landscape. There's a lot of investment that does come out of China through various funds and through various offshore vehicles. So it's certainly very big from an investment standpoint, number one. And then number two, as I alluded to earlier, many of the world's best projects, whether people realize it or not, are actually Chinese devs behind the scene. And then, of course, it's a very complicated market for retail, but at the end of the day, retail frequently still finds a way to participate.
Right. And do you, from the point of view of actually sort of building, when you work with your portfolio companies in terms of accessing the China markets, how do you normally advise them to do that? Or like, what's the I mean, I'm not asking for a silver bullet here, but like, what's the basic like briefing that you give to a company that hasn't yet tried to access the China market, is growing well in other markets, and is now trying to access China. Or, for example, I mean, other markets are fine. Just China's one of the big ones that people find kind of terrifying.
Sure. So again, we're emerging markets. We have boots on the ground in many countries around the world at this point. I think it's like 15 or 16, something like that. And so all these markets tend to be complex and idiosyncratic in their own way. And so I think step one with any market is we help portfolio companies understand what the legal and regulatory landscape looks like so they can engage in a compliant way. And then step two is about making sure that they have access to the various stakeholders, access to the kind of talent that they need on the ground above and beyond us helping them out directly, and have an understanding of market localization and just various aspects like that.
Okay. So it's just the normal grind, but make sure that you have the right people on the ground and you're yeah. No special tricks. It's just the normal grind to building in any market, but just make sure that you're doing it right.
There's a lot of blocking and tackling that certainly goes into go to market in any market, whether it be Chicago or Bangalore. But I think certainly you have expertise that builds up in terms of who are the relationships that you need. You have a corpus of best practices that you develop, and you just build up these basic competencies, just like with anything else, right?
So you guys have invested in some pretty cool projects, right? Like FTX, Solana, Polygon, LayerZero, Serum, Stargate, Zapper, and a bunch of others that are all available on your website. Like, what's your and I know that you invested in these companies relatively early, all of them. What's your general thesis? Like, how do you, if you're giving advice to a new investor in the space, what do you normally say?
Sure. So I think the most important thing is that an investor has to find what works for them. I don't think there's any type of formula that is applicable to all investors. Everyone has kind of a unique style. Just like if you're a basketball player, or if you're a football player, you probably have a style that is kind of your own if you really get to an elite level. So first of all, you have to have a thorough understanding of what it is that you do best, better than anyone, both in terms of being able to provide differentiation so that people want you on their cap table, but then also in terms of evaluating potential investments. So our particular style tends to be more bottom-up, although we do overlay top-down theses of kind of how we view the world. But basically, we're playing long-term games with people that think similarly, and we're looking for people that truly believe in the space and have world-class competency with cleanly differentiated visions. And we make big bets on these kinds of people when we find them, and we help them grow in every way we can in these emerging markets that can be so pivotal to their success.
And what do you see as your sort of like personal thing that you do better than anyone else?
I think that I think that personally, in terms of evaluating, so our wheelhouse, of course, is emerging markets. That's the number one thing that we're best known for. I think that personally, I'm pretty good at understanding kind of the history of technology and things that repeat across different cycles of technological development and what they might look like in a modern context is something that I think that I personally do particularly well. But we have a wide variety of skills on the team such that we have very fervent investment committee meetings.
So basically, a trial by fire of any idea with very intense debate around that, right? Okay. And what are you seeing? What are you seeing as the macro repeating trends from previous areas of history that you think are key in the next sort of like 5-10 years?
Well, I think you have to be very careful with. I mean, we're talking about a technology that is barely older than 5 to 10 years. We're talking about
Right.
a very new technology, and certainly the speed of technological development has increased rapidly and continues to increase more or less every year, just kind of as a general trend. So I think actually one of the bigger mistakes that investors tend to make is they have too much confidence about their ability to identify these long-term trends. Really, you're trying to identify bets that have asymmetric upside. If you try to have crystal ball vision about what the future would look like, A, you're probably fooling yourself, and B, you'll probably miss out on some of the best investment opportunities. So I would kind of take issue with the question itself, I guess.
Sure, but I mean, one of the things that you said that you are a student of history and that you identify
Sure. So in
repeating
terms of
trends.
evaluating if particular projects are likely to achieve product. Okay, so to give an example, so basically, if you look at any financial market in the last hundreds of years, you'll see that the way it develops tends to be increasing abstraction and complexity over time. So you can basically assume that if you have a spot market, that you'll end up having futures and options markets on that, and you'll end up having these increasingly specific and complex financial derivatives and such. So I think having that basic knowledge, which it sounds very straightforward, but it allowed us to really anticipate a lot of DeFi very, very early, knowing that is a basic pattern of all financial markets, basically for, at the very least, hundreds and hundreds of years. So that might be one example about how we use kind of historical pattern matching to analyze current markets.
Okay, and for the next wave of applications in DeFi, what do you see as sort of the likely sort of bright spots that are coming down the road?
So I think for sure what we have is a dearth of liquidity in DeFi, and so what we need are ways to onboard more users, and that can be either institutional or retail liquidity. Institutional liquidity is going to be super complex because a lot of it is going to have to do with regulatory. With retail liquidity, it's going to be that. Plus, I think we're just not ready in terms of our products being usable for normies. I think it's very unrealistic to be able to, like if I said to my mom or my sisters, who are very smart but not really highly technical people, and I tried to explain the concept of a private key and then say, oh, and by the way, after you start engaging with this technology, there are going to be hackers all across the world that are going to be attacking you every day. I think things like this are fundamentally a non-starter. So we have to have an understanding of what mainstream adoption might realistically look like. And then at Sino, we're very actively looking for products that might help us get there.
Interesting. So sort of like more around the user experience side, as well as ways of onboarding institutional liquidity, which sort of probably overlap a lot with regulation that's coming down the road as well.
Yep, for sure. And in terms of the former, I think really when you talk about mainstream adoption, whether it's with DeFi specifically or with any aspect of crypto, really long term, in order for us to stick the landing, we're going to have adoption such that when users are using products or features that we're developing, they won't really even think of it as crypto. They'll think of it as they're trying to get something done for their everyday life. They're using some product or function, but they won't think of it as, oh, right now I'm doing an atomic swap, or I just bought an NFT, or things like that. Really, mainstream adoption needs to be abstracting away a lot of the complexity and the jargon and the dangers, because it's very dangerous for people to engage with crypto in various ways. All of that we have to abstract, and we have to make it about doing cool shit in the real world that people need to get done. Otherwise, we're just never going to get to mainstream adoption. So we're very actively looking at things that might help get us there.
It's interesting. So like, where do you sit on the two sides of this arbitrary divide I'm going to provide for you right now? The first is For the internet to take off, it was necessary for browsers to be created. Browsers were a new piece of software that people hadn't used before, and they had to be taught how to use them to be able to use the internet, right? Are we going to need the same thing for crypto, as in there will be a new piece of software that people need to understand and is separate and separatable from other pieces of technology, or will the crypto technology be integrated into the everyday things that we already use as pieces of software?
That's a good question. I think to some extent it's TBD, and I think to some extent it could be both. I do think that two things are likely to occur in parallel. And so, one, we're likely to see that greater percentages of the population over time are being accustomed to what we're doing in crypto because they want to buy NFTs, so they finally learn how to do something in crypto land, things like that. They just gradually get onboarded one way or another. And then two, we definitely need to have things that are easier and safer to use. I think both of those things are likely to happen in parallel.
Interesting. Okay, so from a sort of like zooming out a little bit, let's talk about sort of the macro crypto outlook and how the events that are currently happening in the wider market are affecting sort of crypto. What's your general outlook at the moment?
Sure. So obviously we're having a lot of macro headwinds. The macro environment is basically the worst that it's been in the entire history of our industry. So that's something super new for all of us, I think, right? In terms of a crypto context. And then I think, for many years, we kind of tried to pretend, or at least some of us did, that crypto is not a risk-on asset, that it would somehow be an inflation hedge or
counter-cyclical asset. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that was a stubborn narrative for many, many years. And I think there's a soberness in realizing that, at least in most circumstances, that's not likely to be true.
Right.
I think it's too strong to conclude that will never or even almost never be true. I think there are some potential scenarios where there might be some edge cases where that's not true, but certainly we have a far more sober understanding of what we're doing here and its relationship to the macro environment.
Okay, and from the point of view of what happens next with the Fed, or what happens next with China, I mean, I know a lot of people are worried about the shadow banking system in China and the likely sort of collapse of the property markets there that may cause sort of like onward effect elsewhere.
People have been worried about that for at least 10 years, but
yeah, I mean, absolutely,
okay.
But doesn't make it wrong, right?
That's also true. Yep. That's also
so
true.
like,
Just like people have been
are
worried about too much money being printed for years and years, and we're starting to see the effects of that. So that's definitely true.
So do you think that there's a likelihood of a China collapse in the next 2 years around the property market or the financial markets in China?
So if you're talking about a sector-specific collapse, so for example, with property specifically in first-tier cities, something like that, I think there's a reasonable probability of that. If you're talking about something that is a more extreme or broader collapse, whether it be political or economic, I'd say that's probably pretty unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the more interesting question is about de-globalization, because it does seem quite clear to me that we are now reversing globalization, and we've had decades now of pretty extreme, incessant march towards greater global connectivity and towards globalization. And for the first time in many, 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 many years, I mean, decades,
right.
Certainly at least 40, 50 years, that's now reversing. And I think that we really need to think just in general, but also in our industry, about what exactly de-globalization might look like if it continues, which it looks like it will.
So what does that mean for crypto? Like, why should crypto care about that?
Well, I think that For one thing, we've seen that crypto is correlated to the macro environment and de-globalization. Globalization, I'm not a trained economist, but it seems to me that globalization is definitely had a relationship with the low inflation that we had for many, many years. So de-globalization might be a reverse of that. But also, for example, are we going to have a balkanized internet? Does that represent an opportunity or a risk for what we're doing in crypto? I would argue probably it's an opportunity. Decentralization could be a counterweight to increasing balkanization of the internet, which is something that we've definitely seen. I think there's a lot to think about when it comes to deglobalization.
Okay, so let's take an example of the balkanization of the internet. I think it's a fascinating topic,
Sure.
and I think that, one of my favorite sort of discussions I ever had around the Great Firewall of China was that someone said to me, "It's not an information barrier; it's a trade barrier." And I was like,
I'm not quite sure I would agree with that. I think it's probably both.
right.
I would say both.
But his point was that it meant that there were local businesses that could be created in the local market that would have otherwise not been able to compete or exist against Google, Twitter, whatever. And
yeah, I would be inclined to agree with that. Yeah.
I certainly agree that it started off as an information barrier. Like the policy the Chinese government adopted didn't go, well, let's create a trade barrier that means that local businesses survive. But I think the effect of it has been incredibly, you can compare it to sort of like the South Korean trade barriers that ended up creating the shipping industry in South Korea and things like that, around how effective it's been at creating local innovation. Now,
sure thing.
I see. Go on.
Please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, where's the? I see that's a factor, but where's the opportunity of that? Where the basis of it is essentially a nationalistic desire to create local industry. So if you're a global business, like how do you take advantage of the balkanization of the internet?
Sure. So I'm not. So decentralization seems to me like a natural counterweight to balkanization if we're rebuilding, in a way, rebuilding a tech stack in a way that can't be censored. That seems like a much more powerful concept than just using a VPN. I think that I think that it's likely more relevant to the new economy that we're building rather than existing industries being able to use our technology to get around the balkanization of the internet. I think it's probably more relevant to the new stuff we're building. But I mean, these are good questions. I don't think anyone necessarily has the answers, but it's definitely worth a watch.
Yeah,
I would agree though that it's the Great Firewall is both. I would say it's both information and trade barrier in terms of effectively what it is, right? Regardless of the initial intentions, I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, for the average Chinese person, definitely it's difficult. Like I lived in China for a year and a half. It was a while ago, and the information barrier is definitely real for like your average taxi driver or something like that. But for your more middle class person, like being able to get information, like being able to access Wikipedia, being able to access Facebook, being able to access things outside of the China market is not. It's not. I'm not going to say it's trivial, but it's definitely doable.
Sure, that's true.
Wanting to use those services has basically gone away as a result of the homegrown services basically being super better and easier in most ways, and the information barrier is maintained. But that couldn't have happened if China didn't actually make sure that a big local economy that serviced all of the needs of its people from the point of view of those products and services actually emerged as well.
Sure thing.
Which is a fascinating.
And I would add that I don't see the Great Firewall. I don't think it's really intended to 100% block people out. I think of it more as a nudge. It's designed to increase the degree of difficulty and nudge you away from using international companies or accessing certain types of information, things like that. It's kind of like, what was that book, Kahneman talked about the concept of a nudge? Was that Kahneman? So anyway, it's like it's nudging people.
Yeah, although that some of that research has been debunked recently, but I do love the underpinning of it. It's actually like the really interesting thing is that the lot of that research has been found to be sort of like non-statistically
research, you mean, about nudges?
Yeah, about nudging, and but like now there are entire
the bottom line for the Great Firewall though is they're increasing the degree of difficulty. They're not trying to make it impossible for people. First of all, they wouldn't be able to do that. But secondly, I don't think they intend to do that. It's designed to be leaky in some ways, but really, it's in many ways it's like you're playing a game against an AI, and it's trying to learn all the time about your behaviors, and then if it identifies that you're circumventing the Great Firewall, then it'll kick you off for a period of time or slow your connection or things like that. But it's not really designed to completely prevent you from accessing certain websites or anything along those lines. It's more designed to make it difficult, and in fact, again, I don't think it would be possible to make it to completely block out international websites, even if that were the intention. So
so like from the point of view of governments interfering with markets, like what are your thoughts on the Tornado Cash censorship, which is a sort of censorship of a different type?
Sure. So this reminds me a lot of the battles that we had a generation ago about encryption. And so at one point, the certain code that could be used, certain encryption code was deemed illegal to code itself. And then that was viewed unconstitutional. I feel like we're rehashing some of this. So to me, it seems pretty ridiculous to say that the code itself for Tornado Cash should somehow be illegal. And then I think it's you start to it seems misguided if you start saying, well, X percentage of transactions are for illicit activity, so we're going to deem it illegal on that basis. This seems like a very dangerous precedent to set. So I'm overall not super sympathetic to the government's actions in banning a type of technology rather than the illicit conduct itself. I would frame it in that way.
Right. And so,
and I certainly am not thrilled about big companies, Microsoft that owns GitHub, deleting the relevant GitHubs that are related to Tornado Cash. I'm certainly not thrilled about that either.
Yeah. I mean, so like, what's the action that should be taken? Like, what should the US government have done instead? And B, what do you think should be done in response to people removing things from GitHub?
So I would say that the government should be focusing on illicit conduct itself rather than types of technology. That's my kind of basic framing. And then in terms of Microsoft deleting certain GitHubs and things like that, I think that's basically a danger that we have in that is caused by excessive monopolization in the tech industry. I think we need more decentralization. I think we need less monopolies in traditional technology, so we have less of these problems, because it's certainly Microsoft's prerogative to make that decision. We just have to have a better way of having alternatives.
Okay. And let's take the Tornado Cash example and just sort of go back in history a little bit and sort of look at things like Napster, right? Music sharing services. Sure. Where, there were legitimate reasons that people use Napster. There was file sharing, and there was, people quite happily sharing things that were actually their creation, but there was also the facilitation of copyright infringement of music artists, and it was actually the facilitation that they were done for. Like, is this not just moving the same kind of concept onto a new platform? in
That's a
terms of
good question. I
enforcement?
think that so in terms of Napster, they built a platform that was using a specific type of technology,
Yep.
using torrenting, right? And
I
so
know torrenting came later. I don't think was Napster
torrenting came
torrent.
later. Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
So I'm a
I
little
think
rusty on some of
torrenting.
these details.
Yeah, torrenting was like the
But
response to Napster. So when Napster came down, people
right,
went,
okay.
"Wow, we'll find ways of decentralizing this, so you bastards can't get us."
Understood. So if you're having a platform that's so again, to be clear, I'm clearly a little rusty on some of these details. If you have a platform that is hosting
Yeah,
content that is stolen content or whatever,
yep.
that seems a lot different. That seems like a much fairer regulatory target than a type of technology that could be used for many different types of purposes. It seems that um, one is there seems to be a fundamental difference for me between a type of technology and an application that uses that technology. So I would probably have to look into some of the details of Napster and some of the historical details. I'm a little rusty on those things. But again, I don't think you should be banning code, whether it's for encryption or for Tornado Cash. And I think you have to be. I'm skeptical about banning types of technology, and if you have some kind of application that is being used for illicit purposes, that starts to maybe be fair game. But I would have to really think very carefully about these things.
Yeah, I think the problem with all of these things is it's like it's just really hard, right? It's grey, and everyone is trying to find a path forwards.
Sure thing. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
like
I mean, I don't sympathize. Like, U.S. regulators are definitely getting it wrong. It's just a
right,
disaster. It's not well
right.
thought out at all, and it's not fair in many respects. But I am for sure very sympathetic to the difficulty of regulating our industry in general. There are really tough questions to answer for sure, and so it's really a lot easier to say, well, that's definitely not the way to do it, which is kind of how I feel about what the United States is doing. But in terms of what thoughtful regulation looks like, thoughtful and fair regulation that protects consumers, and that also is pro innovation. Man, that is a really tough job.
Right.
I have a
Right.
lot of sympathy for anyone whose task is to stick that landing.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that our industry, doesn't actually really engage either. Like I spoke with the president of one of the biggest sort of blockchain companies in the space, and he said, "Look,
Yeah,
we go and work with we go and sit down with the European
yeah,
regulator who's doing a open." Consultation on how these things should be regulated, and we're the only people in the
right.
room. Like, where's the rest of the industry? We're just like sitting on the edge and complaining, rather than actually leaning
Yeah,
in and going, like, this is what could be a path forwards. And I think as
sure.
you say,
So I've seen some of that, but also it does seem like this is more for the United States, but it does seem that in the United States that people have almost been there have almost been negative incentives for actively engaging in good faith with regulators. I'm a little skeptical of getting a fair hearing in the United States, frankly, but I certainly, in general, support more interaction with regulators. Um, in terms of having in terms of fairness and consumer protection and things like that. I mean, I'm enormously sympathetic to regulators if they give us a fair shake and if they're thoughtful and understanding of our industry and support innovation rather than entrenched interest and things like that. But that's not really what I'm seeing in the United States.
and like, what do you take from, on the point of regulation and also wider
Yeah,
point for the market, like things like the Terra Luna collapse? Like, was there
sure.
would there have been clearer regulation that could have been in place that could have done that? And like, what do you think that's going to affect? That what the collapse is going to have an effect on the regulatory sort of response?
So I would say that it certainly the Terra Luna collapse has cast a pall over our whole industry, and it's really going to be it's really going to make our job a lot more difficult with our interactions with regulators for probably years. As a result of that, it's going to be really hard for us to shake that off. And so, to me, the primary takeaway for Terra Luna is we have to do a much better job of self-regulating. I think that we really let a lot of people get away with a lot of things, and we're letting projects that are fundamentally unsound metastasize in front of all of us without calling people out. And I think that's not good for anyone. I think it's super dangerous, and we've certainly seen that with Celsius and with Terra Luna, and there are probably numerous examples. We just fundamentally have to do a better job of calling people out and saying what's not okay and things like that, rather than just saying, oh, well, yeah, but they onboarded 1,000 users, this week or whatever. I mean, look, so did BitConnect at one point. I mean, come on, we have to police ourselves. Otherwise, it's just really bad. Yeah, for fuck's sake, right? So, like, we have to police ourselves better. We're doing a terrible job about it, to be honest. And so, that causes all kinds of problems.
Do you think that there's any silver lining out of this? Is there anything good that's going to come out of this?
I mean, I guess I always like these kinds of quiet periods when the LARPers leave and the more serious people are building, and I really think that's where you make your money, and then in bull markets you find out how much money you made. So I guess that's a little bit of a silver lining, but fundamentally we need to stop making these mistakes where we're collectively enabling these very unhealthy projects to grow in front of all of us without calling them out. I mean, it's clear that we can in certain situations. We've all called out hacks. I mean, look, it's still grown, but we've all called it out. We all collectively decided. I mean, for the most part, we all collectively decided, hey, this is not fucking okay. This is not acceptable. Again, it's far from a perfect market mechanism. It's still grown considerably, but we've called out BSV, right? Collectively, we got off to a shaky start with that. A lot of exchanges, frankly, I would say, enabled BSV and Craig Wright and all that. Eventually, we got it right. It took far too long. But those are two examples to me that show us that we can more or less collectively say that things are definitely not okay. But I think the problem is that Terra Luna was really like an upper class hex in a lot of respects. It was a hex in a better suit.
Sophisticated.
And what's that?
A little more sophisticated. Had a little bit more style.
Hex like in a better suit, like I said, but it's still fundamentally not okay. And I think that we collectively failed. Not everyone, but most of us failed in not self-regulating. Yeah. So we for sure need to do a better job. It's proven that we can do that in very select instances, but we need to do a far better job, I think. Myself included.
Do you see like an industry regulator, like an actual industry regulator coming out eventually, as in a self-regulator, like for example the pharmaceutical industry has,
I think it's more or less inevitable at some point. Due to the chaotic nature of our industry, it may take a little longer. And I think we'll have to be very carefully that it's not co-opted and things like that. I think it's more or less inevitable, and I would also argue that it's very necessary. But just, we're not good at this. We haven't been good at it in the entire history of our industry, and it's super important that we get better at it.
So, like, from the point of view of, obviously, you're you're super bullish on DeFi and on the future of
long-term
sort of
bullish, yeah.
Long-term bullish. Do you think
Yeah.
CeFi centralized finance has a future, has a place?
Sure, absolutely. I think of I'm not a decentralization zealot. I think of centralization and decentralization as a continuum. And, at one extreme you have centralization, at the other end you have decentralization. I think what we are likely to find is that most products and functions have a sweet spot that's somewhere along that continuum. Sure, for some things it might be centralized. We might find that stable coins should definitely be centralized, just as an example. Or something else, maybe we will find that the sweet spot is decentralized. For the vast majority of products and functions, we'll probably determine ultimately that it should be somewhere in the middle, or maybe that both decentralized and centralized versions of that function or application have merit. But I definitely think that the most likely future and the most sensible future is a mix of decentralization and centralization.
Interesting. Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap it up. It's been such a pleasure having you on the show. If people want to find out more about you, or follow you on Twitter, or find out more about Sino, how do they do that?
Sure. So our website is sinoglobalcapital.com, and my Twitter is Matty Sino, MattySino. And our company Twitter is Sino Global Cap. That's SinoGlobalCap. Sino Global Cap.
Matty, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
More utility, then you better call on these guys. I'm going radical, I'm going radish, I'm going radical, I'm going radish. Hyperspeed DeFi, never on a decline, building the future, I feel like a savage.